Welcome to the Dell Technologies Power to Protect podcast, where we discuss innovation and thought leadership in the data protection space.
Hello and welcome to the Dell Technologies Data Protection Power to Protect podcast. I am Jenna Spazey from Solutions Marketing, and today I am sitting with my colleague Pete Gerr. Pete, would you please introduce yourself to our audience and tell them what we are going to be discussing?
I will. Thank you, Jen. Good morning. And glad to be here on the podcast. So I am Pete Gerr, and I lead our marketing efforts at Dell Technologies and Dell EMC for our cyber recovery and our cyber resilience solutions and services. I'm actually a rebound returning to Dell EMC after about 18 years. So it's fun to be back, and I'm really excited to be here today on the podcast. Thanks.
And we're happy you are back. And, we're going to get right into this. So thank you. Please introduce our guest.
Thanks, Jen. So I'd like to introduce Jim Shook, who is also a colleague of ours at Dell Technologies. Jim, would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about your role here at Dell Technologies?
Thanks, Pete. So happy to be here with you this morning. I'm actually celebrating my 14th year on the EMC side now with Dell this week, so it's fantastic. I am the practice lead for the cybersecurity and compliance practice in our global technology office. So what that means is I'm spending most of my time with our customers in the field talking about their cybersecurity issues, security transformation, and then time internally with our great marketing and product teams on cyber recovery solution mainly, but also security components of our other solutions in DP.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on your anniversary, Jim. That's awesome. It's a great time for us to have this podcast. So you touched a little bit, Jim, and we'll get started, about your and my kind of shared history, right? So before I joined or rejoined Dell Technologies about 5 months ago, I was at a service provider, actually Iron Mountain's partner of Dell Technologies. And you and I were working together on a joint solution between Dell and Iron Mountain in the cyberspace and in the sheltered harbor space, which actually sheltered harbor is a topic that we're going to talk about in a little bit and go deeper on. But a little bit of our shared background, and that's when you and I started working together jointly on our cyber recovery solutions, and specifically around, like I said, financial services, healthcare, and other industries. So just to kind of kick off, we're in a new decade. Right, it's February 2020. I'd hope you'd agree with me that we could maybe, looking back at the last 10 years, refer to the 2010s as the decade of the cyber attack, really when cyber security, cyber threats, this idea of a stereotypical hacker in the basement. And now we're looking at nation states sponsored attacks on infrastructure like power grids and banking, et cetera. And even NotPetya, which is one that you and I have tracked for some time, that our listeners might have read about in Wired magazine or really anywhere. But it seems that every day we read or hear about another major corporation or a country or a city being crippled by a sophisticated cyber attack. You spend most of your time, traveling and meeting with Dell's largest customers in banking and healthcare and government. How would you summarize sort of the current atmosphere and preparedness and readiness that enterprise organizations and even small and medium organizations have today? What's the temperature out there?
I still think it's all over the board, Pete. It's interesting. I've had this practice now for about 5 years, and back then we had to really explain the threats. People didn't understand the new threats of destruction and ransomware. They were kind of stuck in the old data theft kind of paradigm. And so we don't have to do that anymore. Unfortunately, the ransomware and destruction attacks like NotPetya that you mentioned are in the news and kind of top of mind. But I think the preparedness is still, it's scattered. It depends on the organization. It depends on the industry.
Yep.
You and I talk about industries a lot. I would say financial services tends to be the most prepared for obvious reasons. But then you'd think somebody like healthcare would be well prepared, and they're just not for the most part. Clearly, there are outliers on both ends of that, but there's no solid kind of range for organizations at this point in their preparedness level.
And we are going to talk a little bit, as we go on here in the podcast about sort of different industries. But maybe just to reset, why are we even talking about cyber? Why is it an issue? And the way I describe it is really regardless of whatever business you're in listening to this, if you sell cars, if you manufacture computers, if you work for a government, if you're a small to medium business, your business is really driven by data. 95+% of businesses globally rely on the internet today for their business. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? And so if data really drives everyone's business today and our lives, it makes sense that it's a very valuable asset and therefore attractive, right, to would-be cyber terrorists or criminals, et cetera. So that's kind of the context of this. And I think executives and boards and certainly CISOs, security officers, think about that data as their most valuable asset, but I don't know that the general population really gets it.
Yeah, I don't think that they're there. And even on the business side, how they think about it and how they think about recovering from these attacks and preventing the attacks isn't necessarily well understood at the business level still. One of the things that I talk about frequently with our customers, Pete, is the triad. So in cybersecurity, there's the triad. Sometimes it's called the CIA triad, which represents confidentiality, availability, and integrity of data. And the reason I talk about it a lot is many people, especially on the executive level, are very stuck in this idea of protecting the confidentiality of data. So the classic data breach, somebody gets in and steals the data, and that's not a good thing. And they can sometimes monetize that. Where we have the shift, and where I think this has made it more difficult for some of the organizations we're talking about, the ransomware and destructive attacks are against the availability of the data. So with the advent of cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, if a bad actor gets in and encrypts your data, then they can extract a ransom from you. It's very difficult to track those payments. People don't realize that they can't just go to their backup and restore the data. The IT team realizes it, sometimes the cyber team doesn't, sometimes the business doesn't. And so it really gets a little bit complex, and people don't necessarily like to dive under the covers from the business side on the IT assets that they have, but they have to, or else they can't really understand these threats. And I think that's one of the problems we've had as data becomes more important. You need to understand more about your data, and we're not there.
And almost having a common language, right? So, we often are talking to technical decision makers at organizations, right? Our customers or not customers, but right. So backup people, data protection people that run the infrastructure of the company. But we also then talk to, and they obviously their day is about making sure availability, applications are available, data is available. Up at the business level, those executives tend to think more around risks. And I don't know that they make that connection, together, that data is value, but it's also risk if we're not able to protect it and recover it. And I think the sophistication of cyber attacks today, and they've become part of our daily news, so we may not even think about it that often. Most people don't. But if you went to your bank on the way to work today and wanted to get a Starbucks or needed to get some cash, and you were not able to get funds out of your bank account, your personal bank account, because your bank had suffered a cyber attack, that would be a very real moment, right? So I want to rewind a little bit, a few years to a particular event. Actually, it's 2014's cyber attack on Sony Pictures. This is one that a lot of people heard about, a lot of people who are not in the cyber world or in IT, because it was a real watershed moment, I think, in terms of the sophistication and what the attackers did. Can you talk a little bit about, your knowledge of that, your experience with that attack, even though it's 6 years ago, but it really changed the direction?
Yeah, gosh, 6 years ago almost at this point. And you're right. People talk about it, that it's old now, but it's still very relevant. And it was the watershed moment for a lot of these attacks and the defenses against them. So for people who may not know, the attackers, probably North Korea, decided that they didn't like Sony Pictures being around anymore. And so they crafted a cyber attack with the intent to destroy them. And at that point, we'd really had attacks that focused more on stealing data, as we talked about before, and then you'd monetize that, either stealing intellectual property or embarrassing people or whatever it might be. Sony, as North Korea unrolled their attack against Sony Pictures, they did steal data and they used it to embarrass the executives, but they also tried to destroy them by destroying all of their data so that they couldn't operate. And one of the first things they did in that destruction was they deleted all of their backup data.
Yes.
So what was so important about that, going back to the triad, was we had the confidentiality attack as always, but this was really a first large-scale availability attack, the purpose of which was to wipe this company from the face of the earth.
Yep.
And that was really the watershed moment. Plus, it was at a point in time, like you said, Pete, about data being so important, where that was actually possible. You think about 10 years ago, if you wiped out most organizations' data, it might hurt them a little bit. It might be like taking a building out of action for a little while. But if you lost all of your data and you're really a digitally focused company, which all of us are now, that was the danger there. And so, immediately organizations responded to that threat of attack, especially in the financial services world, that it was different and we had to prepare for those.
Yeah. So, right. For our IT folks, for our executives out there, right, that's the difference. So cyber attack occurs and it goes after your production environment, right? Maybe ransomware appears on your servers and throughout your company. What are you going to do first? You're going to go check the backups, right? You're going to hope your backups work. And if it gets worse than that, you're going to hope your DR and disaster recovery plans work if it gets to that scale. And in the case of Sony, neither of those worked. And it was really the first time, I think, that a public example of that was made. Obviously, that has happened in the past, but of the scale of Sony Pictures, who ended up losing a lot of intellectual property, unreleased films, unreleased scripts, right? The data that was Sony Pictures was either destroyed or let out on the internet, and had a very fundamental and financial impact on that company. And that was 6 years ago, and we've seen a lot happen in those 6 years. So thank you for that, Jim. With that sort of history and that background, let's roll the clock forward to present day. What do you see, really as the top 2 or 3 changes or developments around cyber resilience, cyber protection of data that have really happened in even the past year or 2 years? That's sort of that next change that you see.
Yeah, you threw out a key term there, Pete, which is the whole idea of cyber resilience.
Yeah.
So we've talked about cybersecurity. We've talked about cyber recovery, which is the idea that if you're attacked, you have the ability to recover your data and restart the business. Cyber resilience kind of takes that up one more level, maybe 2 more levels. And that's a major change that we've seen really kind of take hold in the last year or so. The idea being that under cyber resilience, it's an umbrella that covers cybersecurity and cyber recovery and all these things, and it's more at a business level. And there's just a realization that these attacks are going to continue virtually nonstop. Some of them are going to be successful. We can't block them all because they're very sophisticated. We're very dependent on our data and our IT infrastructures, and there's no longer any perimeter, right? We've got all these great applications and mobile, and we can work from everywhere in the cloud and all of these different things. So
there is no
the idea
such
there
thing
is
as
the attacks are going to happen. We need to be resilient to them so that we can continue to operate the business even in the face of the attacks.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just saying that there's really no such thing as 100% prevention of attacks anymore. And maybe there never was, right? And when you couple that with the sophistication and the scale of attacks, there's some pretty interesting websites people can find from companies that are almost these real-time maps of attacks going on, malware, ransomware throughout the globe. It reminds me of the movie War Games, from when we were kids, right? This global map. But I mean, it's in the tens of millions of attacks every day, right? Now, they're not all successful, but the volume of it is absolutely such that I don't think any company can hit 100% prevention. And so if you accept that we're not going to stop every attack, then you have to look